Go ahead and open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 21. Now, you had a little warning. What comes to your mind when I say slavery in the Bible? Servant. It is an interesting point. Now, I'm not up on all the instances, but many times in the New Testament, where it should say slave, it's been translated servant in most English translations. So we think we're a servant of Christ, and maybe we should unionize, and if he doesn't pay us well, we can all quit and go somewhere else. But the fact... Do what? But is that a COVID joke? I don't think I get it. But anyways, but in actuality, those of us who belong to Jesus, yes, we're adopted as sons. There's a number of different allegorical metaphors for what salvation means. But when we are bondservants of Jesus, we are actually slaves. And we are doing much better with Jesus as a better master than we were when we were slaves to sin. So when you think you're going to revolt and go on strike and ask for better pay, forget it, buddy. You're a slave to Jesus. You do what he says.
Old Testament, New Testament.
Well, there's 1,000 years of difference in some places.
The people have come to do different things, and sometimes a slave was looked like, you're going to talk about it there in the Ten Commandments. It is because it's a part of you, it's a part of your family, and you're to treat them well. It's not like they're supposed to be mistreated. They're not like prisoners.
Well, especially when your slave was your fellow Hebrew. And as we look at the laws, you'll notice that when it talks about when your brother is your slave. Now, he might be of a different tribe. He might be from the other corner of Israel. But definitely when you had a fellow Israelite as your slave, there were definitely special rules for that. God wanted them to remember that they were all a part of the same family. And every 7 years, your slave was supposed to go free, especially your Hebrew slave. And if he wanted to purchase his freedom, and it's 7 years till the year of Jubilee, till the 7 year was up, well, he has to pay a lot because you're going to be out of a lot of labor. If it's just 1 year left before that 7 years, well, he doesn't have to pay so much for his freedom because
they can all drive them.
We'll get into that. If they want to stay in your house, which we often, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm not going to argue for slavery in any way tonight, obviously, and I think that should just go without saying. Just because slavery was acceptable in the ancient world does not mean that it's something we should be pushing for today in any form. I would think that we would all know and agree that the race-based slavery that we had in this country was especially evil, and even the Romans would probably look down on us. The ancient cultures would look down on us because you didn't have to be a certain color back in Bible times to be a slave. People went in and out of slavery all the time. Former slaves achieved their freedom, and people went into debt, and they went into more debt than they could pay. And so they would sell their ability to live. And this was better than living on the streets and not knowing where your next meal would come from, because a slave had a place to sleep and food to eat. You not only did your master own you, but he had to take care of you just like he would take care of cattle, a pet dog, just like his own family members, just like he would provide for the needs of all of those other things that were under his care. His slaves were also under his care. And so rather than wind up on the streets begging for food, if at all possible, you would go into slavery, and that was still better than starving to death.
Who found that out real quick?
Hungry people.
In the Bible.
The prodigal son, right? And that's right. That's a good point, Jerry, because he says to himself, I've joined myself to this man here in this foreign country, and I'm taking care of his pigs, but he's not feeding me because I'm willing to wrestle the pigs for what sustenance they have. So wouldn't it be nice if I went home to my father's house? I know I've shamed him so much that I no longer deserve to be his son, but he treats his slaves so well, perhaps he will take me as a slave. And so now I think one of the temptations we have when we talk about slavery under the Old Testament law is to say, well, we don't have slavery, and so none of this is relevant. Okay, now we do have slavery. There are more enslaved persons in the United States today than there more so even, I think, I keep hearing this statistic bandied about, so I'm not going to vouch for its authenticity, but I've been told that we have more slaves in America today than we did at the height of the African slave trade. It's a different type of slavery, and you can't regulate it because it's all illegal. We're going to talk about regulations for slavery here. We're even going to talk about young women being owned by a man, and once again, it had to do with improving her stage of life. She comes from a poor family. They can't play with the big dogs and get her married to be the primary wife of some guy, but they can improve her status in life by getting it to where she is a concubine or a second or third wife to a fairly well-off man. And as much as we don't like that situation, back then it would improve her situation. And really, for women back then, the only other option in that society was to be a prostitute. And so we're going to talk a lot about the lesser of two evils. We're going to talk about people wanting to fill their bellies. I know we're Americans and we love freedom, But imagine if we took you, who wants everyone emancipated, wants everyone to, all women to be independent, strong-willed feminists, and all men to be free to seek out and we just airdrop you into the many of the countries that still exist today and still practice slavery today. Well, how are your ideas going to go without an army behind you to enforce them? Not so well. So God provides rules for a society where slavery and having concubines is already deeply entrenched in the culture and in the mindset. And we can look at it thousands of years later and say, good grief, you mean God was okay with girls getting sold as concubines and people selling their own children just because they went into debt and all of that stuff? Well, no, God was not okay with it. But when he says, if he were to say there should be no slavery, so there is no slavery, slavery answered a lot of questions in their society. Today we have a welfare system. Back then, they had slavery. Today we have, food stamps and assistance, and back then they had relatives, and your relative could purchase your debt, and you would be a slave to your relative. And supposedly, hopefully, if anyone would treat you right as a slave owner, it would be your near relative who redeemed you. But in every society, somebody falls through the cracks. And so you just there was a high infant mortality rate back then. And so even though they had zero birth control, sometimes families still only had one child. And then that guy would grow up to have only one child. And that means that eventually there's a generation that doesn't have any aunts and uncles, doesn't have any first cousins. And when you get into financial trouble, no one is there to redeem you. And hopefully a good master will buy you as a slave, pay off your debt, and you will work for him. It's not a perfect society. And a lot of terrible societies have been created trying to build the perfect society.
Isn't that why Ruth went back home? She didn't have no way to support her.
You mean Naomi? Naomi went back home to Bethlehem. Now, I was trying to look for the passages to cite about this, but everything in the law of God is connected to so many other things. So this idea of slavery is also connected to the kinsman redeemer, who's going to buy you as a slave and treat you well because he is your near relative. And also, the slaves get to go free every 7 years. And every 7 years, you're also supposed to let the land go fallow. I was asking Larry what he would think about that, and he seemed to say he was okay with it, but his banker wouldn't be, you know. And I was reading, and I encountered more of that as I was preparing for this talk. And you couldn't even get your combine out there if it came up volunteer that year. You still weren't supposed to have a big organized harvest. You were just supposed to go pick some and eat it. And you would live off of that for a year. And your servants would live off of that for a year. And I guess if your banker called you up and said, hey, I'm dying over here since you didn't plant your fields, you could say, come on over. There's plenty for everybody that the Lord has provided in the soil. And one more thing I want to say about that, I think it's interesting. It's obviously for a rest for the soil. And I thought it was so interesting that the damage that man can do in 6 years, God says his soil only needs 1 year to recover from. I thought that was pretty interesting, you know. Something to think about. It's amazing God's power, regenerative power. Is what I saw in that. But we will get into the law about the slaves. Now, like I was saying, it's so easy to be looking at the law of God and say, well, we don't have slaves. We can skip this part, basically. None of us are ever going to legally own slaves, and so regulating it seems pointless. But when we discuss how the culture and society was before God gave this law, and then we see the improvements that God made with his law, or at least what they were trying to make, because mankind always takes everything God gives us and twists it around to where it's no longer a good thing. But when we see the comparison, this is how most ancient societies worked, and this is how it worked under God's law. I want us to see the heart of God as we study this, so that we can see that God says, okay, I'm not going to self-righteously declare all slavery is now illegal, and everyone who gets into real bad debt is just up a creek. There's still going to be slavery, but it's going to be a better version of slavery that takes care of people. And and the law will be that you must be a good master. And even if you are still managing to not be a good master, guess what? He's going to go free after 5 years or 4 years or whenever that 7th year rolls around. He's going to go free. And if you want to keep him, you better be good to him. Because he will have the option to stay in your house and keep working for you if that is the best his life situation can be. And so it's in your best interest. And so let's jump into it. So before I turn the introduction into the sermon, which I seem to have a real penchant for doing. Exodus 21, verses 1 through 11. We're going to go over some passages that have to do with slavery in the Bible. And like I said, it's going to be connected to the year of Jubilee, leaving the land to go fallow. And it's going to be connected to these other wives, not your main wife, not the wife of your youth, but these concubines that might have coming with you. In fact, our last passage will be about the female captive that you capture in war. How do you treat her? And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And hopefully we'll get to all of it, because I think it's all very interesting. So read with me, if you will, in Exodus chapter 21, starting in verse 1. And this is your main passage for the rules here, so we'll try not to talk it to death, but we'll get the rules down. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. So we're getting to Jerry's question. Ear piercing in the Bible. All you back row fundamentalist Baptists, just take that. No, I'm just kidding. I was behind a car 10, 12, 15 years ago, I don't know. And I'm trying to see, what is that says on the back of his windshield? Little sticker about yay high. It says something about body piercing. Body piercing saved my life, and I got closer, and it was 2 hands with nails sticking out of them. And that's what body piercing saved my life. And I thought, okay, it's not as bad as I thought. But, because I'm never going to tell you it's wrong, but personally, I'm not a big fan of the body piercings and the tattoos and things like that. No. On this perfect canvas, no. But we do have an instance here. Now, I think this is interesting, and we're always thinking with our modern mind, right? Slavery's always bad and everything. But like I mentioned before, many times people would go into debt, and they would go into debt so bad that they couldn't pay. And don't forget that something that is not a reality in our country, but was a reality back then, there was debtor's prison. And slavery probably looked better than debtor's prison. And so if you could sell yourself to someone who would pay your debt and then you could work it off with them, that was the option. Now this guy, he will serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he'll go free. What do you think about all this? If he's single, he goes out single. If he's married, he takes his wife and children with him. If you gave him a wife and they have children, the 7th year, he doesn't get to take them with him.
I've thought about that a few times. I don't quite.
Does that seem unfair?
Yeah.
It seems unfair, right? Well, allow me to make a fool of myself telling you what I think, and then you can go home and turn on Dr. Stanley, and I'm sure he will, on the TV, and I'm sure he will tell you I was wrong or something. I don't know. Dr. Phil. No, don't watch Dr. Phil. I mean, he's okay, but don't watch him. I do like his line, and how's that working out for you? Whenever someone talks about how stupid they live their lives, and then he goes, how's that working out for you? Now, this is no longer politically correct, which is fine with me. I hope it is with you. How much does the upkeep of a woman cost? Depends on the woman. I know, right? And some of us were blessed that not much. It's not there. Some of them are a burden. Some of them are not such a burden. Elsie's only a burden because of her attitude. She just wants to, she's got the stubbornness from my side of the family. But everyone thinks that in ancient world they saw women as possessions. Yes and no. Just like slaves, are they possessions? Yes and no. They are people that you possess. So you can't just do whatever you want with them like a dog or a cat or a cow. They are still people, at least in the ancient world. So you own a person differently than you own someone else. If this master... Now it makes sense that if he comes in single and then he'll go out single when it's 6 years later. We don't have a problem with that. We don't have a problem with that. If he's already married, maybe his whole family works in your house and his Little girl is pouring drinks at your table, and he's out working in the field, and your wife dusts and cleans and everything, and well, he takes them with him when he leaves. We don't have a problem with that. When this young kid, 17, 18, 19 years old, he's in debt, or his father was in debt, and he gets sold into slavery in order to help work off the family debt, whatever the case was, he matures. Think about the difference in your life from the time you were 18 till 6 years later, right? Right? Did you learn a lot about the world in those 6 years? Yes. Yes, we did. I know I did. And you go from stupid kid, and especially if you do the old-fashioned thing and you get married in that span of time, and you even have a couple of children in that span of time. See, you're 18 plus 6 is 24. You're a totally different man, right? Not to mention, now in our day and age, we all float around as free agents, and every once in a while a male free agent hooks up with a female free agent, and they want to hitch themselves together, and so we bless it. There's no money that changes hands except you should pay the preacher something. And the old joke is, well, how much do I owe you, Pastor? Well, whatever you think she's worth is what, you know. And so then all of a sudden it looks bad if he doesn't pay the preacher really, really well. But anyways, we don't understand the work that the master went into to get this guy a wife. Because in ancient cultures, there's negotiations, there's a bride price settled on. There's a dowry and there's a bride price. You're taking this guy's little girl. Dad ought to get something out of it. I mean, she's priceless, but Dad ought to get something out of it. But she needs to bring an amount of status to the marriage as well. This was probably another one of the master's slaves. So we are preventing this guy because I see we're chewing on that. This was another slave of the master. You know, we're chewing on that. Okay. Matchmaking is hard. I would never attempt it. I don't have a matchmaking bug. I'm not, and I don't think most men do, but I've never once have I met a friend and said, you know what, you would do well with my long-standing friend that not me. But in the ancient world, they discuss these things. In the Bible, they try to marry someone with a similar family to their own. Now, and you've probably experienced this. You've all been married. The way you grew up doing things is different than how your spouse grew up different things. And those are things that you assume until all of a sudden you're living together and it's you're butting heads because of these things, you know. I remember when I got married, you know, it's not a big deal, but it was one of the little things. My family talks during commercials. We don't talk during the program. My wife only wanted to talk while I was watching TV, and she didn't wait for commercials. It was one of those things. She's better now. And I also learned to pause the TV. I learned not to watch anything on network television because you can't pause it. But I learned to pause the TV. Things more important than that. So you want similar values. You want similar virtues. You want both parties in the marriage to be benefited from this marriage. It's not all about falling in love. That's how the ancients saw marriage. A considerable amount of work went in. Even if you go out and find the girl yourself, your dads still have to talk to each other and work all this stuff out. And discuss, our family is this way, how is your family? We're Baptist, you're Methodist, I don't think our kids should get together. How do we stop this? You know, I know it's not considered acceptable in our time, but that's how it went down in the ancient world. Plus, if the master gives this male servant one of his other female slaves as a wife, and this does not have to be an abusive type of thing where she's sold like cattle. I'm just saying that the master plays matchmaker. She's a good one. He's a good one. Why don't we get you two kids together? the master's out an extra slave just because his 6 years is up. That's not fair to the master. And when slaves are born in your house, they're your slaves too. And that's a form of property. That's a form of wealth. And now just because the guy's 6 years is up, he's going to take all that away from the master? And I've already taken too long to explain this. So consider this. He can leave alone and make money. And what can he do with that money? Come back and purchase his wife, purchase his children, and the master's happy. The young man has achieved something, and so he's happy. His wife is happy to be with her husband and their children, and so that is the ideal scenario. It's not fair for the master to do this good thing and provide him with a wife, and all of a sudden he's out 2 slaves instead of 1 whenever the other guy's time is up. Does that help explain? Yeah.
I've never thought of that angle.
Right. Everything at this level is a transaction. We've been talking about holiness, and we've been talking about heritage, and we've been talking about legacy, and tonight's nuts and bolts type stuff. So keep in mind that anytime someone leaves the house as a free man, he can come and purchase. He's now free to make the money and purchase whoever he wants, basically. And that's a lot of hard work. We would maybe look at that situation and say, no, it should be automatic. That should be a human right. Not necessarily, Even in this country back in the day when it wasn't considered normal for women to go out and work, if a man wanted to support his wife and support his children, and he wanted to have 6 or 7 children, in the case of my dad's family, 8 children, they didn't want it, it just happened. When my grandmother told me that, I almost asked her about her views on birth control, but then suddenly realized I didn't want to discuss that with my grandma. That might be a little awkward. But to her, it just happened that way. And my grandpa killed himself he didn't die from it, but on the graveyard shift at the zinc smelting plant. And this used to be the ideal, The woman cares for the home. The man does whatever it takes to provide that thing. And I'm not going to say that's good or bad tonight. I'm just saying that is the mindset that we are working with even 3,000 years ago. The man is free to come back and buy his wife and kids. And that is how it is fair for everybody. The master and the young man who either through his own issue or maybe his father's issue wound up in a situation where he had to be sold into slavery. But this is amazing. In 6 years, he gets to go free. Why? Because he's also a Hebrew. He's part of God's people. And since I've taken so long to talk about all this, let me go ahead and skip ahead some. God is going to say several times that you don't really own the slaves. All of the Hebrews belong to me. And he says that about letting the land go fallow. That's because the land actually belongs to me. And tied up in that also is this idea that every 7 year, so what's 7 times 7, 49? That 50th year was what?
Jubilee.
Year of Jubilee. And whatever land you had purchased in Israel, it reverted back to the original family that owned it, right? Or it was supposed to. I was told once by my Old Testament professor that we don't have any evidence that they actually practiced it. But this is how it was supposed to go. So we're going to talk about how it was supposed to go.
Did you go to the courthouse, check that out?
Where is that courthouse that still has the records from Old Testament Israel?
It's there somewhere.
Yeah,
probably.
yeah. No, it was burned down by the Palestinians. But the reason the land can go back to someone who didn't pay for it is because who actually owns the land? God does. God does. And I thought that was so profound. Who owns the people? Well, really, God does. And who owns the land? Well, really, God does. And that makes everything a lease, right? You lease a slave for 6 years. That is the maximum lease on your slave. because he actually belongs to God. You lease him from God. How important, how are you going to treat that slave knowing that you leased him from God? How are you going to treat the land? How are you going to treat the land that you bought from, you bought it from someone else? It's not the land you inherited from whichever ancestor helped conquer the land way back when. But you bought it from someone of another tribe, and you've been farming it, but you've only got a 49-year lease on it at the most. And you even pay the price for the land. You're supposed to pay the price for the land based on that idea. Well, this is only a 10-year lease. Your land is not worth as much as you're asking for only a 10-year lease, because the year of Jubilee is only 10 years away, or the year of Jubilee is 25 years away, or the year of Jubilee is 40 years away. So that's a big price to pay. So God owns the land. He gave it to those original families, and you're only leasing it from the people that he gave it to. That's a lot to think about, right? That's a lot. But what do I say every Sunday? God gave us all our money. We give back to God in the offering because it all belongs to God anyways. It's the same idea. And so we don't need to look at the Old Testament law and say, oh, that was all the rules about what we're not supposed to do. We don't have to live under that anymore. Jesus has forgiven us. Yes, he has forgiven us. But God never, the original intention of the law was not to beat us down. It was to help society lift us up. And so when we engage with questions of society and things like that, I think it's good to look at the law, not follow it exactly. We are not Old Testament Israel. There's no mandate in the Bible to take every single law from the Old Testament law and try to enact it in Washington or Jefferson City or Warrensburg. But there's so many principles we can learn as we study it like this.
But they were God had told them to take care of one another. In fact, he says you can't charge interest on a loan for a brother. And in so doing, basically what he's doing here is trying to keep the Hebrews together.
Yes.
And,
as big and as populous as they get, God wants them to know they're one people.
When they come to this country, some of those done very well here in this country.
Yep.
And so others come.
Mm-hmm.
But I think God made that for the welfare for them, like Ruth and Boaz. She ended up marrying him, and marriage was a big deal back then.
Yeah. It was about so many more things than just your feelings for each other. And it still is. And that's what shocks a lot of people when they get married, is now they have to worry about all these other things too.
It is. But, you look at David, Samuel,
Jerry, who was David's first wife?
Who, what?
Who was David's first wife?
Was
Saul's daughter. You got it, man.
Daughter.
I'm proud of you, yeah.
Michelle?
Well, we can say Michelle if it makes us feel better, but it says Michael in the Bible. Kind of awkward in our language, huh? In Russia, all the Michelles are pronounced, all the Michaels are pronounced Michelle anyways, so we had to get used to that. Let's keep going in this passage, verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. And so the pressure, I don't know if you caught the general attitude of the passage was, when you take a wife, it's a grave, terrible thing when you just say, she's not as great as I thought, so we'll just put her back. She's not a fish. and I encountered this in several passages, it's a disgrace to her, and it should be a disgrace to you that you decided she wasn't. You made promises. You gave the impression that you were going to take her into your house. And so the idea here is don't let her down in the first place. Now, if you have to, if you just can't stand her, can't stand the sight of her, whatever the case is, here are the regulations for it. You took her as a female slave, not to just work for you, but to be a wife. And don't ask too many questions about this because I really wasn't able. I really don't know what to think about this passage. It's too different. It's too different of a mindset about women and marriage and everything to treat them like sort of like property like this. But it really this passage was trying to be protective of her. If you decide you don't want her, what does it say here? He shall let her be redeemed. He doesn't have... She's not his property to sell to a foreign people. And it is true that women have been taken advantage of for centuries. Sometimes the feminists go pretty far in the wrong direction with their idea of always, men have always been oppressors and everything. I always ask about Abraham and Sarah, who was in charge there. It really seems like Sarah was in charge most of the time, but and that was over 3,000 years ago. But yes, think about the fact that God has to tell this guy not to do these things. You purchased her. She was going to come into your house, and not just into your house, but into your bed. That was your intention, and now you've decided you don't want her. You don't have the right to sell her to somebody else. You don't have the right to... You have the right to turn around and sell her to a good Hebrew family that will take care of her where you failed, pal. But you can't just turn around and sell her to whoever you want, the Amalekites, the Canaanites, the Philistines, and... Who cares? Whatever. I decided I didn't want her. I'm going to toss her away like a used Kleenex. No. That is what is... I know it doesn't sound like it's in as strong a terms as we would like it in our day and age, but this is a prohibition against treating women like cattle. And I hope you can see that in the scripture here. And if he purchased her as a slave, intending for her to be the wife of his son, which was common, he's got to treat her like a daughter. There's a number of things you don't do with a daughter. You might be tempted to do them with any old young lady who happens to be in your life a lot. And at the risk of being crass, I'm going to tell you a little thing from England. Where I went to school in England used to be a big manor house. We're talking 150, 170 rooms. It was a private residence with all those rooms and servants' quarters. And it was Victorian times, and there were lots of rules, and there were secret passages in our manor house that we lived in, and that was a lot of fun. But the reason there were secret passages is because the servants needed to get to places without walking in the same hallways as the nobles who owned the place and their guests. Now, was this because the nobles thought they were too good to share the same hallway with the servants? Yes. But there were also some practical concerns. Those noble men did not need to be taking advantage of the servant girls. And that was, and especially in the Victorian age, and I don't know how much you know about English history or the Victorian age, but the Victorian age is famous for being when everybody was very uptight and prudish, which we're Baptists, so we like that. We like the Victorian age, okay? And there was a stereotype of the washerwomen, the women servants who did the laundry, because they were outside a lot, hanging up laundry and scrubbing in the wash buckets. And so these noble men would have access to them because they weren't inside the house in their own secret passages. And And we were told that the stereotype was apparently a little bit true, because if you look at church records, when they christen a baby, everybody's birth certificate was at the church because they would christen babies at the local church. There were a number of babies where the mother was listed as a washerwoman at the local manor and no father was listed. And so it's very sad. It's very obvious if you're a man, because unfortunately male sexuality is all about conquering and taking life by the horns and everything else. But this has been ever since the fall showed us that we could point that in any direction we wanted instead of pointing it in the direction that God wants it. Unfortunately, men have been happy to think, I'll just go for all I can get with whatever attractive woman is handy. And so if you purchase this gal with the intention of, when they're of the right age and when everything else is taken care of, you're going to marry her to your son because you think she'll make a good wife for him, you better treat her like a daughter in the intervening time. She's not just handy nearby. She's going to be your daughter-in-law. Treat her like a daughter. And I hope that's vague enough but specific enough that you catch my drift. And so, despite what people might tell you, and I'm glad we're talking about this because this is the silver bullet that ruins a lot of people's faith in God. Some atheist or some doubter will come up to you and say, oh, really, your God is all powerful and all good? Your God's in favor of slavery. And they'll point out all these passages. And if you go to a church where no one's ever talked about this before, you might be inclined to say, I had no idea this was in the Bible. And maybe they won't talk you into giving up your Christian faith entirely, but maybe they'll start that slippery slope. Oh, this stuff, the Bible was willing to go along with slavery back before we knew it was wrong. How many other parts of the Bible were just a product of the times that it was written in, and we don't really have to listen to it today? Our church teaches and believes that the Bible is not a product of the times it was written in. It's a product of God. And sometimes you have to understand the times it was written in, but primarily it is a message from God, and all of it is still profitable. Like it says in 2 Timothy 3:16, all of it is still profitable for reproof, for correction, for all of these things. So I hope that we are talking enough about what these passages mean that no one's ever able to come up to you and say, oh yeah, your God's in favor of slavery. He doesn't like women. He thought women could be bought and sold at will back in the Old Testament. And the truth is, women were already being bought and sold at will. And God stepped in and said, you need to have a concern for what is best for this woman. Because to you, she's just a slave. But to me, she's made in my image. Because you got to throw in the whole law. That's how the law starts out, right? All people are made in the image of God. Any questions, or have I just talked this to death already?
When Adam and Eve was created, and God created them, there wasn't that slave problem.
No, there was not that slave problem.
And the boys got married, and but between them and to Abraham, we don't have a lot of knowledge about what's going on in there.
Well, we know the world got so bad so fast that within 1,500 years, God was destroying mankind except for one family. Right. We don't have a lot of details.
So after the flood, God set this in order to try to, and at that point in time, they didn't know that the Israelites or Hebrews were going to be the Israelite people either. But when they were given was in Moses' time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When God gave it them. So that's been quite a while, even from Abraham to Moses. And how many things? Just look at our situation in the last 20, 30, even 40 years that's happened here in the United States with different things that shouldn't happen. But God had to put a stopping point somewhere did they carry it out to a certain degree?
The law?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what they do, they actually defiled the law.
Oh, yeah. They broke the law all over the place. And the number one rule was worship only God, and they screwed that up all the time.
Look at Paul. He thought it was the opposite for a Christian. Shouldn't he be a Christian? And he was trying to kill him. But, God, as he gave Moses the law, that law was to help us to live with one another, that we take advantage of one another. And basically, this is what this is.
Yeah.
Not taking advantage of somebody in a situation.
Moving on to verses 20 and 21, Cheryl. If you beat your slave to death, he was avenged. Which I can only assume means that you died. You died because you received the death penalty for killing your slave. He wasn't cattle. He was still a human being. If your slave survives, it says you will not be punished because that's your money. For the slave is his money. That means you beat your slave. He didn't work for you for several days, and you did it to yourself. So don't mercilessly, discipline your slaves. Don't incapacitate them. In 26 through 27, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. Once again, you're too heavy-handed, and now you've lost a slave. You lost a part of the slave directly for your own result, and indirectly because the law says your slave will go free because you destroyed the eye or knocked out a tooth in verse 27. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. Now we're going to jump over to Leviticus. Leviticus has a long passage. I'm going to try not to talk to death. Leviticus 25:35. Now, this is all about whether or not you can support yourself. If you can't support yourself, an option is to become a slave or be treated as a sojourner, as we see someone who's not an Israelite but who lives within the land. And we're just going to read here, starting in verse 35. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So right there, and this is one of those, it's not just your blood brother, but it's your fellow Israelite. And you treat him, it doesn't matter. You always treat him with dignity and respect. Even if you're treating them as someone who is not an Israelite, you're still going to treat, there's still rules. You're still supposed to treat the sojourner well. For remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so you know what it's like, is what God tells his people over and over again. Verse 39, if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired servant and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of the Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. There's what I was talking about. God says, even if you purchase them, you don't own them. They are my slaves. And not just because God made them, but how did God purchase them? Did you pick up on that? Is Elsie helping you take notes, Laura? Laura's one of my note takers. Poor girl. How did God purchase the children of Israel? It said it right there. It's probably still on the screen. For they are my servants. Oh, it was. Yep. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. So think about that. God struck the Egyptians with plagues. He worked at it. Now, we don't think of God as ever exerting himself or ever, but that's how he portrays it. Hey, I did a lot. I brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. I purchased them. And we have a similar idea with Jesus. Jesus purchased us at a great price. So we cannot treat each other, fellow Christians, as if we own each other. We cannot treat each other with disrespect, knowing that we don't belong to each other. We don't even belong to ourselves. We belong to Jesus who bought us. And so it's always a lease. It's never an actual purchase. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. So they're not really slaves. That's why God gets to say they go free at the year of Jubilee. They get to go free after 6 years. Verse 43, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. There you go, Jerry. There's the fear of God again. If you fear God, you will not mistreat your Hebrew slave. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule over one another ruthlessly. So we do see here that the foreigner, the sojourner that lives in the land, they can be owned as slaves, and it is primarily to make the distinction between your fellow Hebrew and those of the rest of the world. But like we said earlier, God has commanded that we treat the sojourner well. We treat the stranger well. So it is implied that we are not ruthless with them either. But they don't get the special considerations that the fellow Hebrew does. And these are not exact laws for us today. They're just principles that we can learn from. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as the time of a hired servant. If there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionately for his redemption some of his sale price. So the sojourner that lives within the land is bound by the year of Jubilee. If he has a Hebrew slave, that Hebrew slave is going free at the year of Jubilee. So let's give the worst possible scenario. We're going to go ahead and be racist for a minute, okay? We Hebrews who live here in the land, we know that we're all good people, right? I mean, we fear God and we have these, we try to follow the law of Moses and everything. And there is a family down the road. They are either Kenites or they are Canaanites. Maybe they're like Uriah the Hittite or whatever. For whatever reason, they moved into Israelite territory. They're not one of us, but they live here. They have different ways. We can't really trust them to be good to our people. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to have that attitude about people that live down the street from you, but we all know what it's like to have those feelings about people who live down the street from you. Or maybe we don't. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one. I don't know. But there's a distrust there. And I'm going to go a little bit further and say there's distrust for a good reason, because God's people are supposed to be living under the law of God. The pagans, many of them live very terrible lives. It may not be as true in our day, but it was more true in their day. So this fear is, your brother lives in another state, your fellow Israelite, your near relative lives in another state, and his neighbors are more pagan, and that's who the rich person is in that area. They're not Israelites, but they live in Israelite territory. And he gets into a situation where the best thing for him to do is to sell himself to this rich foreigner. What is supposed to happen is you are supposed to show up the next day with enough money to purchase your relative from that foreigner. Does that make sense?
You call him on the cell phone.
Yeah, called him on the cell phone and says, hey, tonight what I had to do was I owed money, the collectors came, and to get myself out of hot water, I sold myself to the local rich foreigner. He seems all right, but I don't know how he's going to treat me. And you say, I'm on the next plane. And you're on the next plane, and you say, yes, you bought my cousin, and I'm sure that you are going to be a great master to him. However, I would much rather that I be the one in charge of him, and I would like to take him off of you because I'm sure he'll be a burden to you. And so I've brought my checkbook. And you square this away because, let's be honest, we're the people of God. They're the people of whatever devil they worship. We don't trust them to own our brothers and sisters as slaves. Is this starting to clear up some of this for you? Or am I just causing more? Think the Clans of Scotland and every Godfather movie you've ever seen where they take it's all about the family.
Before all this happened, wasn't the Hebrews supposed to drive all these others out of the...
They were supposed to utterly destroy the 7 nations that lived in the Promised Land.
And they didn't do that.
Well, they didn't do that. So that's one reason we have foreigners living next door. Also, as time goes on, now keep in mind, the Israelites brought foreigners with them. I don't know if you know this or not, but Jethro's family, Moses' father-in-law, some of his clan actually settled the Promised Land with the Israelites. They were called the Kenites.
What?
Kenites, K-E-N, like Barbie's boyfriend, Ken. The Kenites. Actually, that was her brother, but nobody knows that, except us nerds. They were the Kenites. If you remember the story of Deborah, and they defeat the enemy army, and he flees into a tent. It's the tent of Heber the Kenite. And his wife talks him into taking a nap while he's hiding from the Israelites, and she drives a tent stake through his temple.
You're talking about Deborah the judge?
Deborah the judge, and her and Baruch go out and fight the battle.
She wanted him to go with her.
Well, I know I'm getting off topic here. Baruch would not go into battle without her. And here comes the other politically incorrect thing to say. She says, you shouldn't be scared to go into battle without a woman. What is this? You're a man. Go be a man. He says, no. He felt like God was with her, so he needed to take her into battle with him. She says, as punishment, the glory of killing the enemy king will go to a woman. And sure enough, the enemy king, Sisera? I don't know. That name's kind of coming to me out of the air somewhere in the back of my brain. Sisera flees the battle that he is losing, and he sees a tent in the distance, and he knows it's not an Israelite tent, and he runs up there and he asks for, will you hide me, please? And the wife of Heber the Kenite says, yes, come on in. And she knows who he is, or she figures it out somehow, and she feeds him, and he lays down for a nap, and she drives a tent stake through his temple. There were foreigners who actually settled the Promised Land with, and then after that, you have all the nations around. They do trade, and they do commerce with the nation of Israel. And if you read closely the stories of David, like everybody in his cabinet is from a foreign country. It's ridiculous. And one of his main generals was Uriah the Hittite, and this guy over here was a sojourner, but they were good at things. So the children of Israel was never this pure place where everyone... So God had rules for what to do with the foreigner living next to you. So if that's what you're tripping on, I hope I explained it some. But and keep in mind, what's her name from the Battle of Jericho? the harlot that helped out the spies. I don't. No, not Rachel, but it was what? No, it wasn't Jezebel. She was a bad guy. She went to hell. Rahab, the harlot, she got to join the people of Israel, being a foreigner. Uriah the Hittite, all these people. There was always going to be sojourners in the land. Ruth came from Moab. They were to be kind to them. They were the church, but we don't really trust them to own our fellow Israelites as slaves. We don't know what they're going to do to them. They might sell them off to Egypt or somewhere, just like our ancestor Joseph, Plus, that means that when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery without a care for where he went, they were not being very good Israelites, were they? So that kind of thing's prohibited. In fact, I ran into several things as I was leafing through here. It's like, there's this patriarch broke that rule, and that patriarch broke this rule, and it's so funny how much is actually wrong. But the patriarchs did it because they were pagans. I mean, they were coming out of a pagan lifestyle into worshiping the one true God. That's
trying to keep the line pure, so to speak. The Hebrews trying to think who it was that Abraham's brother or something like that was to go back somewhere and find a wife
Yes. It was valuable to Abraham that his servant go back to his own clan to find a wife. That was so important. In fact, Esau marries 2 Canaanite women, and it talks about how that drove his father Isaac and his mother Rebekah crazy. They could not stand their Canaanite daughters-in-law. They were just too pagan, And Jacob flees for his life to his uncle Laban's and winds up marrying his 2 daughters and everything. And Esau saw how happy that made his mother, and he decided to marry her. He sent back for a wife too, I think. I don't remember, but let's skip ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Do I want to go over this? Well, in the interest of time, let's skip to Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14. This is my last passage, and I thought it was interesting. I don't know what it's like to be a soldier and find a woman you want to marry after you just killed her husband or maybe her dad. I don't know. But so I'm a little out of my depth. But a war bride was considered normal. I know that in the Iliad, one of the conflicts between the Greek generals was about how they had to sacrifice one of them's war bride. And so he turns around and says, and tells Achilles, I'm taking your war bride. She's mine now. And Achilles gets mad at him because he's about 15, even though he's got the strength of the gods. And he throws a big God-sized tantrum or something like that. Anyways, I like Greek literature. Not enough to actually know anything about it. I just know enough to get me in trouble. But anyways, Deuteronomy chapter 21, I want you to compare how God says to treat these women. And I'm no expert, but in a war zone, how are women often treated by the conquering enemy? Probably with rape. Probably with rape. And I hate that that still goes on today. I hate that it still goes on. I love our American armed forces, but unfortunately it's endemic to the human condition. When we conquer a people, we feel like we have the right to do everything we want. And so take that mindset and compare it to what God says here in verse 10. Chapter 21, I'm sorry.
There are some countries, I don't know which ones they were, that when they went in, they just such matters that they went in and raped the women in order to get them pregnant, in order to
kind of a genetic conquering
to conquer
thing, and say, those children are, you're.
I can't remember what country.
Yeah. Probably one of the most famous examples was the Japanese invasion of Korea during World War II.
This is more current than that.
Well, yeah, that's getting to be longer and longer ago, wasn't it? But women were conscripted from Korea into the the Japanese barracks to be comfort women and to help the guys with their time off and everything. And it's a big part of some of the racism between the Koreans and the Japanese, and that's all. Now you know all I know. I'm no expert on that, but it's a terrible thing. Now compare that to this. Verse 10, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. She shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go in to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. That's a very interesting word at the end there. Like I was saying earlier, in several of these passages, if you say, I want that woman, and then you change your mind, the impression I get is you, pal, you, Mr. Not Very Manly Man, are doing a bad thing. You're doing a bad thing to her. And she's not a slave. She's not cattle. You can't just do that to her. And I know I'm probably way deep into strange, offensive things now, but and we have sympathy for this young woman. We cannot imagine being taken captive in war, and then now we're supposed to be happy that this guy wants to marry us, and he's going to give us a whole month to mourn the soldiers in our family that died at the hand of his army. But like I said, I want you to compare that to this idea that we conquered them so we can treat the women however we want, with whatever we want to do with them. It's a much higher level of dignity and respect than the pits of mud that mankind normally wallows in, is the point I'm trying to make. And I don't know if I'm making that point or not, but I'm desperately trying. We feel for her, but she's not going to be somebody's slave somewhere. She's going to be this man's wife. That accords her a certain amount of status, at least within the household. And and they valued being a good wife. They were kind of trained. I'm probably getting out of I'm probably inventing things instead of knowing things now. But imagine that you looked at your lot in life and said, "My village was conquered. My father and brothers died in the war. But as I look at my life before me, my life will go best if I try to be the best possible wife to this guy." And that's not, I know, it's not politically correct. It's not what we want for our daughters today. It's not any of those things. But he's not allowed to treat her like a slave. And if he decides he doesn't want her, she's a free woman. And she can go try to make her way in this Israelite society somehow. Someone else could pick her up, and she could be a proud wife of a good man, because apparently this first guy that chose her wasn't a very good man. He humiliated her by saying, "Now I don't want her anymore." I don't know. At this point, we should probably let some of the women talk, I'm sure. Not because I've probably stepped in it a number of times tonight, and I need you to set me straight. But yes.
Culture and day and age, being a woman, her hair would have been really long.
Yes.
And part of this says she had to shave her head.
Yeah.
So then, therefore, when she walks out a month later, if he turns her out,
They see the shame of the short hair.
that's
So, yeah.
part of the humiliation
Yeah.
he's caused her
Yep.
by saying, I want
Right. And now, don't get all hung up on the short hair, because when you would take a vow before God, you would shave your head, and then people would see as your hair was growing, that's how long you have lived under that vow. And then when your vow was done, you would shave your head again, and people would see you were no longer under that vow. If she's going to be married to an Israelite, she is supposed to become an Israelite. So this month is there for her to adjust to her new circumstances. And she cannot dress she can no longer dress in the clothes she once wore in her own village, in her own pagan society. And let's not forget that. These are the people of God fighting a pagan society. So she doesn't get to be a Philistine anymore. She doesn't get to be a Moabite anymore. She doesn't get to be an Edomite anymore. Probably should have just stuck with Philistine, because we all know the Philistines are bad guys, right? But she does have a chance to be an Israelite. But she's got to throw away her Philistine life. She's going to shave her head. She's going to burn the clothes, or, never be able to wear the Philistine clothing anymore. She's going to mourn her father's house. So instead of being raped on the battlefield, she is going to be given status as a man's wife. And she's not even going to be touched for the first month. She's going to come to grips with the fact that she is now an Israelite. And then hopefully will do well as an Israelite wife. That's the ideal. Now, if she hates it, she probably wasn't going to make a good wife anyways. But the guy did it to himself. But he's not supposed to humiliate her and decide he doesn't want her. He's supposed to, pull her out of a bad situation. She was going to be somebody else's slave. And he cannot demote her to slave when he decides he doesn't want her. He can't demote her to slave. She's a free woman when he decides he doesn't want her. So it sounds terrible to us in our modern ears, but it's so much better than what she would have had without the law of God. And it's so much better than her Philistine brothers would have treated any of our Israelite girls. Let's not forget that too. So, all right. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Did I really step in it tonight? Ladies? Is it bad?
So what? What's the meaning?
Tell it like it is, so I did okay? All right. Is God a sexist, misogynist, terrible person? No, it wouldn't fly today, and we're not bucking for it either, But yes, Jerry.
In this time of day, what are we trying to do here?
In this time of day, what are we trying to do?
With this situation, that's way back then.
Yes.
Okay, and we know about that. But how do we apply that to today's society?
I feel like we live in...
We've got a problem, they say, with women slavery.
Yeah, sexual slavery. We have a sexual slavery issue.
We do, but as Christians, see, we're talking as Christians, we're like the Israelite people.
Yeah.
And as Christians, we don't do the slavery wife thing, or shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
Okay, but in regards to really focusing in on today's society, we know what's going on. There's just so much ugliness going on in our world today. But, in their terms, what God set that law out to do was to protect that woman or that sojourner, that person, or the Hebrew person, to try to protect all of them. That was the law. So in our society today, what do we do as Christians?
We need to have our eyes out there, and this is part of the problem of we as conservative Bible-believing Christians, we often find ourselves on the opposite side of the fence as the Christians who want to always talk about social justice. And I don't want to get into some long historical storytelling about this, but, well, I guess I could sum it up like this. Over 100 years ago, there were some Christians, the reason they got so concerned about social justice on this earth is because they lost sight of the next world.
Lost sight of what?
The next world. We are a little less concerned about getting everyone justice in this world because we know the next world is coming. We believe in a heaven. We believe in a hell. We believe that the biggest problem everyone has, even the people starving in the street, their biggest problem is that when they do die of starvation, they're going to stand before a holy God and get sent to hell. We Bible-believing Christians know that that is their biggest problem. They may not be ready to hear that that is their biggest problem, so we feed them, and we house them, and we tell them about Jesus. But unfortunately, there's a different strain of Christianity that says miracles aren't real, heaven and hell, this idea that ultimately God's going to provide justice, we don't really believe that. So we need to go out, we need to march in the streets, we need to petition Congress, we need to see to it that justice happens now. And it's a good impulse, Who really wants to tell the people running the soup kitchen, no, that's not biblical? No one does. But unfortunately for so many of them, at the heart of it is a lack of belief in the gospel. Okay? So we want to do things, and we want to seek justice for people here on earth. And what I'm trying to say is, okay, yeah, so there's some liberal, blue state, Democrat, mainline denomination types who want to march in the streets for justice. Guess what? We are also interested in justice on this earth. If we stand up for the oppressed, we will show them what the kingdom of God is truly like. People who are in such a bad situation that they basically have to sell themselves into slavery, or our modern equivalent. The people enslaved to drugs. The girls caught up in, let's not even talk about human trafficking. Let's talk about the girl who is so scared of her boyfriend that she cannot leave him because he will find her, or he won't. She can hide from him, but in her mind, she is in slavery. This is all around us. We think we live in a nicer world than this ancient world, and I'm of the opinion that no. We are still this ancient world quite a bit. We get a spare moment on the battlefield, we rape whoever we can find. And this is the world we still live in today. The human animal still acts like this as far as I'm concerned. And so I think we need to have, we shouldn't let that other strain of Christianity always control the conversation on social justice. We should be out there looking for the oppressed. We should beat up the oppressor. I think that that other strain is often wrong about who the oppressor is and who is oppressed and what the best solution is for it, but we can bring the truth. We can bring the truth, but sometimes we're so busy wrapped up in taking care of our own families and taking care of our own church that we turn a blind eye to the darker corners of our own society. And it's not that we mean to, we're just busy. We're very busy. And we're trying to better our own lives, and we are, and we have an obligation to protect our own families from those kinds of things. But we need to broaden that definition of family, and that's why we did foster care. We took in kids that were very vulnerable.
Christian churches that are doing very good.
Yes.
Feeding people,
yes.
taking care of their health,
yes.
And they're trying to put them down, put them away, or government is.
Yes. They want their feel-good, do-gooderism to overtake our gospel-driven, care for the needy.
They had a church down there that was taking care of seniors with no incomes and really doing a good job. Their health care, taking care of it, feeding them, making sure they got the nourishment they needed. Guess what? They step in and say you can't do that.
Yeah. Also, I think there's a lot in this slavery stuff for employers today. Employers are not the same as slave owners, but some of the principles are the same. If a slave owner wants the best out of his slaves, he should take care of them really well. And especially if he claims to be a slave owner who believes in God and fears God, he should live like he believes every one of his slaves is made in the image of God. And today, employers, anyone who has anyone else working for them, should keep that in mind, because we do, ever since the Industrial Revolution, we do think of people as machines.
Sure.
How much can I get out of them? How many hours can I talk them into working? And you know what? It ain't going to kill you to work more than 40 hours. But by the same token, we should remember that they have homes and families, and we should not only look at our own bottom line, but we should look after the care. If we looked at it like the rich man who had a lot of slaves back in Bible days, the biblically minded, the God-fearing slave owner would look at that as an extension of his own family. These are the people that God has entrusted me with. And I believe there's a lot in there for employers to say, these are the people that God has entrusted me with. We still got to make a profit. We still got to take care of the shareholders. They are also part of our extended family that God has given us to take care of, but we need to take care of our employees too. So there's my answer. All right. No, I was going to get it before 7:30 and I did not. Oh well. Something to shoot for next time.
See, did we change that clock?
I did. It's accurate. But anyways, I'm going to close this in prayer. Father, we thank you for all you've given us. We thank you for your love and your kindness. We thank you for this Bible study, Lord. Lord, help us to see the oppressed, maybe that we have never noticed before, right in front of our faces. Help us to take on this attitude that people are not slaves, they're not cattle, they're not machines, they're people. Every single one of them made in your image and worthy of value, dignity, and worth. And I just pray that we would treat them so. In Jesus' name, amen.